We now have the keys that are necessary to start to systematically unveil the Bible's chronology. The first two keys revealed the divinely ordained blueprint or framework for time, which governs the progression of God's plan. Keys 1 and 2 basically say that the blueprint is a week of 7 days of 1,000 years each. The next two keys resulted in the discovery of God's redemption chronology, which exists alongside the Bible's actual chronology. Key 3 says, at the end of every Jubilee cycle of 49 actual years, God adds a special 50th year of grace. This must be a measurement in the redemption chronology. Key 4 is the principle of unreckoned time, which says that God does not count times when his people's sin causes his plan of redemption to be suspended. This is convincingly revealed by the 479 completed years recorded in 1 Kings 6:1, which are 131 years short of the actual time. Now, the total times of servitude are also 131 years. So if they are subtracted from the total time, this gives exactly 479 years. The only alternative to this solution is to force the periods in Judges and Acts 13:20, which add up to 610 years, to fit into the 479 years of 1 Kings 6:1. This involves torturing the scriptures. On the other hand, when the key of redemption chronology with its unreckoned times is accepted, there is a perfect harmony of all the stated times. Again, this requires the existence of a separate redemption chronology in which the years out of fellowship are not counted. These latter keys define how time is reckoned on the redemption chronology. They are like counting the number of days of pay owed to an employee. Weekends are not reckoned because work is suspended then. That's key 4. But bank holidays, which are like jubilees, are added as extra days, even though no work was done. Hence they are days of grace. And this corresponds to key number 3. So whereas keys 1 and 2 define the structure of time that governs the redemption chronology, keys 3 and 4 tell us how redemption time, as counted by God, relates to actual time, as counted by man. This is important because the progression of time within God's overall blueprint is according to redemption time, not actual time. We're now going to look at events in the life of Isaac. Remember, Isaac was born when Abraham was 100. At age 5, Isaac was weaned, and he was established then as the seed and the sole heir. In Genesis 15:13-16, we read that God said to Abram, "Know of a surety that your seed shall be a stranger in a land that is not theirs, and shall serve them, and they shall afflict them 400 years. And also that nation whom they shall serve will I judge, and afterward they will come out with great substance." That's, of course, a prophecy of the Exodus. God showed Abraham that his seed would only be able to receive their inheritance after a wait of 400 years. What event initiated these 400 years? We know that the time from Abraham entering Canaan and receiving the covenant at the age of 75 until the Exodus was exactly 430 years. Since the 400 years also ends with the Exodus, this time span must begin 30 years after he entered the land, when he was 105 years old. Now, since the subject of the prophecy was the seed, the start of this time period must have something to do with Isaac, who was the first seed. Now, Isaac was born when Abraham was 100. We saw that in Genesis 21:5. So this time span began when Isaac was 5 years old. This must be the starting point of the 400 years. Something of great importance in Isaac's life must have happened at this time when he was 5. And the child, Isaac, grew and was weaned. And Abraham made a great feast the same day that Isaac was weaned. And Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, which she had borne unto Abraham, mocking. Wherefore she said unto Abraham, Cast out this bondwoman and her son, for the son of this bondwoman, who was Ishmael, shall not be heir with my son, even with Isaac. At age 5, Isaac was weaned, and he was established then as the seed and the sole heir. This is my speculation, but I believe that Isaac was offered up by Abraham on Mount Moriah when he was aged 33 and a half. Why? Because he was a type of the greater seed of Abraham, that's Jesus, being offered up by his father 2,000 years later at the very same place. And that's recorded in Genesis 22. As the ram was offered instead of Isaac, so the Ram of God, Jesus, was offered up in our place as our substitute. The timing of this event is not given, but this is an inference based on the fact that the typology is so exact in other ways, such as its location. And in these exact ways it pointed to the fulfillment in Christ. So I think it's very feasible that he was also the same age. Isaac was the same age as Jesus when he was offered up on Mount Moriah. Certainly Isaac was no child, who had no choice in the matter. A sacrificial animal had to be a full-grown male. Although he's called a lad in Genesis 22:5, this is the same word that was used for the other young men, so it should really have been translated young man. He was fully grown and could easily have overcome his elderly father and fled. So Abraham was not forcing his son, Isaac was cooperating. By faith he laid down his life in obedience, a type of Christ, the greater than Isaac, the greater seed of Abraham. As Jesus died at 33 and a half, I suggest the same is true for Isaac. In type, Isaac, the seed of Abraham, was also a picture of the resurrection of his greater seed, the Son of God, being received back as from the dead by his Father, as Hebrews 11:17-19 says. This was a higher act of faith by Abraham than in Genesis 21, when he cast out Ishmael. Both were hard, but in the first case it was a giving up of the work of the flesh. Whereas with Isaac, it was offering back to God that which was of God, produced in his life by the Spirit, through faith. It was a test of whether he loved the blessing more than the blesser. Abraham knew that God's promise to him must be fulfilled through Isaac, and so he believed God would have to raise him from the dead. When we are called to lay down something on the altar, we need to believe, like Abraham, that if it is of God, he will surely resurrect it. So we need to trust God and put it in his hands. When Isaac was 37, that's when Sarah died. That's in Genesis 23. When he was 40, Isaac married Rebekah. The next time we see Isaac, after his death and resurrection, as it were, in Genesis 22, is his betrothal and marriage to Rebekah, which was mediated by the trusted servant Eliezer, which means helper. This servant was sent by Abraham to bring forth a bride for his son. And this wonderful story is in Genesis 24. Likewise, the next thing after Christ's death and resurrection is that the Father sent his helper, the Holy Spirit, to call out a bride for his Son. She receives him and is betrothed to him on the basis of a promise without seeing him. And that's a picture of us, as 2 Corinthians 11:2 talks about how we're betrothed to Christ through faith. And Rebecca also received his gifts. She's a picture of the bride of Christ. She then embarked on a journey of faith led by the helper. And this is a picture of the Christian life. And this journey continued until finally she sees him face to face and is married to him. And this is a wonderful picture of the rapture of the church. Well, when Isaac was 60, that's when Esau and Jacob was born. We read in Genesis 25:26, "Afterward his brother came forth with his hand holding on to Esau's heel. So his name was called Jacob. And Isaac was 60 years old when she gave birth to them." At age 75, when Isaac was 75, that's when Abraham died. That's in Genesis 25, verse 7. When Isaac was 100, that's when Esau got married. That's Genesis 26:34. When he was 137, that's when Isaac blessed Jacob rather than Esau. And that story is in Genesis 27. God's plan was always that Jacob would receive the blessing, but rather than trusting God, he deceived his father in order to get it. Esau was so angry that he was ready to kill Jacob. That's in verse 41. So Jacob had to flee to Rebekah's brother Laban in Paddan Aram, near Haran. The timing of these events, namely that Isaac was 137 at this time, has to be calculated. Moving forward, when he was 180, that's when Isaac died. Genesis 35:28 says, "The days of Isaac were 180 years." Let's now study the timing of the events in the life of Jacob. When Jacob was 77, Isaac blessed Jacob, and as a result of Esau's anger, he had to flee to Laban at Paddan Aram. En route, on Mount Moriah, as the Jews believe, he had a vision of a ladder connecting heaven and earth, with angels ascending and descending. And that's in Genesis 28:12. And this was prophetic of Christ, as is pointed out in John 1:51. And at this time, God affirmed him as the heir of the covenant with Abraham and Isaac. That's in Genesis 28:13-15. In response, Jacob declares that place as the house of God and the gate of heaven in verse 17, and that it will become the place of God's house, verse 22. He also vowed to tithe all that God gives him. Verse 22, he said, "Of all that you give me, I will surely give a tenth to you." This provides a wonderful confirmation that God planned Israel's history according to great Jubilee cycles. For Jacob was renamed Israel, and God gave him 12 sons from whom came the 12 tribes of the nation of Israel. Thus God gave him a nation, which was born as such at the Exodus. And God planned and gave Israel 3 great Jubilee cycles of grace, that is, from the Exodus to the cross. Thus he gave Israel 3 times 490, which is 1,470 years, not counting, of course, the unreckoned time. He gave Israel these 1,470 years before the Messiah comes to take possession. So, did Israel give the 10th of this to God? Yes, he did, because Israel, Jacob that is, who is renamed Israel, lived 147 years. But his life of 147 years was, as it were, a tithe of the 1,470 years of Israel's history from the Exodus to the cross. Now let's consider the 14 years that Jacob spent from age 77 to when he was 91. You see, when Jacob fled to Laban in Paddan Aram, he served Laban for 14 years in order to marry his 2 daughters, Rachel and Leah. And he worked 7 years for each. First, he worked 7 years for Rachel. It says in Genesis 29:18 that Jacob loved Rachel. So he said to Laban, "I will serve you 7 years for Rachel, your younger daughter." So Jacob served 7 years for Rachel, and they seemed only a few days to him because of the love he had for her. That's Genesis 29:20. However, instead of finding himself married to Rachel at the end of 7 years, he was married to Leah instead. When he objected, Laban said he could still have Rachel, but he would have to work another 7 years for her. However, he was allowed to marry her immediately, that is, as soon as his honeymoon week with Leah was over. We read that in Genesis 29:27-30. Laban says, "Fulfill her week," that is, fulfill Leah's honeymoon week, "and we will give you this one," that's Rachel, "also, for the service which you will serve with me still another 7 years. Then Jacob did so, and fulfilled Leah's week. That's her week of days. So he gave him his daughter Rachel as wife also. Then Jacob also went into Rachel, and he also loved Rachel more than Leah. And he served with Laban still another 7 years. So he worked another 7 years for Rachel, making 14 altogether. These 2 sets of 7 years when Jacob had to work for a wife, the second being a rerun of the first, are a type of the 2 sets of 7 years that are Daniel's 70th week, the second being a rerun of the first. Jacob worked 7 years for Rachel, but at the close of the 7 years she did not come to him. However, another, Leah, came to him to be married instead. Likewise, in his first coming, Jesus worked for 7 years to claim his first love, bride. That's Israel. But at the close of these 7 years, he did not obtain her. However, another, that's the church, came to him to be married instead. When the original 7 years ran without fulfilling his purpose, Jacob, in his love for Rachel, did not give up on her, but he was willing to work another 7 years for her, thus rerunning these 7 years for Rachel. These 7 years took the place of the original 7 years, and as a result of them, he was able to marry Rachel. He did this after his honeymoon week with Leah, which is a picture of the church age. Likewise, Jesus has not given up on Israel, but after the church age, he will work another 7 years to win her. That's the tribulation, and he will marry her as a result. The second 7 years took the place of the first 7 years, as far as Rachel was concerned, for the first 7 years were cancelled, that is, as years for Rachel. The second is the rerun of the first. Likewise, the final 70th week will take the place of the first 70th week as far as Israel is concerned. The first 7 years were not wasted, but as far as Rachel and as far as Israel was concerned, they failed to achieve their purpose. So the original 7 years for Rachel and for Israel were cancelled, as if they hadn't run. And then they were to be run again. In the second 7 years, Jacob had 11 sons through Leah, Rachel, and their 2 maids. The 11th son was Joseph, and he was born right at the end of these 14 years of serving Laban. We read in Genesis 30:25, "It came to pass when Rachel had borne Joseph that Jacob said to Laban, 'Send me away, that I may go to my own place and to my country.'" You see, at this point, he had now served 14 years, and so he was free to leave. But Laban asked him to continue longer in return for cattle. So it was a further 6 years before he left Laban, making a total of 14 plus 6, making a total of 20 years. We read that in Genesis 31:38 to 41. "These 20 years have I been with you," Jacob says. "Your ewes and your female goats have not miscarried their young, and I have not eaten the rams of your flock. I have been in your house 20 years, you see," he says to Laban. And then he goes on and says, "I served you 14 years for your 2 daughters, and 6 years for your flock, and you have changed my wages 10 times. Now when Jacob was 91, this is when Joseph was born. As we've seen, Joseph was born at the end of Jacob's 14 years serving Laban. But Jacob's age at this time is not given directly. However, it is possible to calculate it as follows. Joseph was 30 when he was exalted to become prime minister in Egypt. And that's when he began to rule. We read that in Genesis 41:46. Joseph was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh. Joseph revealed himself to his brethren after 9 years of rule. We read that in Genesis 45, verse 5 and 6. Joseph says, "Now therefore be not grieved, nor angry with yourselves, that you sold me here, for God did send me before you to preserve life. For these 2 years has the famine been in the land, and yet there are 5 years, in which there shall be neither earning nor harvest." You see, Joseph first ruled in the 7 years of plenty, and now in the second year of the 7 years of famine, this is when he revealed himself to his brethren. So by now he had ruled for 9 years. So now Joseph was 39 years old. Now, Jacob at this time was 130. You see, at that time, Joseph commanded them to return to Canaan and to bring back his father Jacob with all their possessions into Egypt. Understandably, under the circumstances, because of the famine, this was accomplished without delay. So Jacob came into Egypt when Joseph was 39 years old. When Jacob arrived, it says that Jacob said to Pharaoh, "The days of the years of my pilgrimage are 130 years. That's Genesis 47:9. So Jacob was 130 when his son Joseph was 39. Therefore, by subtracting those numbers, 130 minus 39 is 91. Therefore, Jacob was 91 when Joseph was born. We can now verify our previous claim that Jacob was 77 when he fled to Laban in Paddan Aram. We've proved that Joseph was born at the end of Jacob's 14 years, serving Laban for his 2 daughters, and that Jacob was 91 at the time. Therefore, Jacob fled to Laban when he was 91 minus 14, that is, when he was 77. Now, when Jacob was 97, he returned to Canaan, leaving Laban, after working another 6 years, during which time he gained much cattle. That's in Genesis 31:41. En route, he meets, and he's reconciled to Esau, and he meets the Lord at this time, face to face in a wrestling match, and that's when he receives his new name, Israel, which means God is Prince. Then they settled first of all in Sukkoth, and then they moved to Shechem, and that's in Genesis 32. When he was 108, Israel believed that Joseph had been killed, but actually he'd been rejected and sold into slavery by his brethren when he was aged 17. That's in Genesis 37, verse 2. When he was 120, when Israel was 120, that's when Isaac died at the age of 180. You see, Jacob was born when Isaac was 60. When Israel was aged 121, he didn't realize it, but Joseph, whom he believed was dead, had been exalted to the right hand of Pharaoh, because this was actually the year after the death of Isaac. When Jacob was 130, that's when he entered Egypt. This was 9 years later, of course, 9 years after Joseph was exalted to become the prime minister. That was 9 years was, of course, the 7 years of prosperity, followed by 2 years of famine. Then, at age 147, that's when Jacob died. In other words, he lived another 17 years in Egypt. He lived in the land of Egypt 17 years, so that the whole age of Jacob was 147 years. That's what Genesis 47:28 says. Let's study now the events in the life of Joseph, who, of course, is a wonderful type of Christ. At age 17, Joseph was rejected by his brethren and was sold into Egypt. Genesis 37:2 says, which happened when he was 17. His brothers were jealous of the great favor he had with his father, as evidenced by his cloak of many colors, that's talked about in Genesis 37:3 and 4. Also, they were angry at his claim that he would be the ruler over them. That's in verse 5 to 11. His brothers then conspired to kill him in verses 18 to 20, but God saved him from death. Instead, he was sold into slavery in Egypt for 20 pieces of silver. That's verse 28. And that's where he served in Potiphar's house and then in prison. When he was 30, Joseph was exalted to the right hand of Pharaoh and began to rule in the year after Isaac's death. In Genesis 41:46, we read, Joseph was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh, king of Egypt. His exaltation happened after he interpreted Pharaoh's dreams, the dreams of 7 fat cows followed by 7 sickly cows, and then the sickly ones ate up the fat ones. And also of 7 plump heads of grain, followed by 7 thin heads, which then devoured the 7 plump ones. These spoke of 7 years of plenty, followed by 7 years of famine, with the 7 years of famine, as it were, eating up the 7 good years, so that they will not be remembered. And that's all in Genesis 41, verse 29 to 31. These 2 sets of 7 years are another perfect picture of the 2 sets of 7 years of Daniel's 70th week. First, there were 7 fat years of grace. That's at Christ's first coming. But because Israel didn't accept him, they were cancelled in order to run again as the 7 lean years of the tribulation. During this time, the greater than Joseph will reveal himself to his brethren, and they will receive him. Thus, Israel's 7 years under Christ are chronologically replaced, or eaten, as it were, by the 7 lean years of the tribulation under the Antichrist. When Joseph was aged between 30 and 37, this was the 7 years of prosperity that are described in Genesis 41, 46 to 53, during which Joseph had 2 sons, Manasseh, which means forgetful, and Ephraim, which means fruitful. These names speak of his forgiving heart for those who rejected him, and his fruitfulness in Egypt, Egypt being a picture of the world. At this time Joseph was in Egypt, known among the Gentiles, dressed in Gentile clothes, with a Gentile wife, but he was not known to his brethren. And this is just like Jesus, who is the greater than Joseph today. Israel believed that Joseph was dead, and did not realize that Joseph had been exalted to Pharaoh's right hand. So Israel did not come to Joseph at that time. When Joseph was aged 37 to 44, this was the time of the 7 years of famine which followed immediately. In Genesis 41 verse 53 and 54 we read, "Then the 7 years of plenty which were in the land of Egypt ended, and the 7 years of famine began to come, as Joseph had said. The famine was in all lands." During these 7 years, the famine was worldwide, a picture of the tribulation, and many from all the nations came to Joseph to be fed and saved. This is a picture of a great soul harvest in the nations in the tribulation. You can read about that in Genesis 41, 54 to 57. Joseph fed them at this time with what he had procured through his work in the 7 good years, as will Jesus. Moreover, in the famine years, Joseph's brothers came to him and were reconciled with him. When he was 39, which was in the 2nd year of the famine, after he had tested his brothers to see if they had a repentant heart, and that they had truly changed, Joseph revealed himself to his brethren. And we see this in Genesis 45 verse 1. And he said this, "I am Joseph your brother, whom you sold into Egypt." Verse 4. Adding that God had used his sufferings to save many lives. Although they had sinned in rejecting him and sending him to Egypt, God, knowing that this would happen, worked this all for good and made it part of his plan. For in sending him to Egypt, he had been able to save many lives there, as Joseph pointed out in verse 5. And so likewise, in the 7-year tribulation, Jesus will reveal himself to his brethren, saying, "I am Yeshua, your brother, whom you rejected, but be encouraged, because God has used my sufferings to save many among the nations." You see, God turned Israel's rejection of Christ for good, because by doing that, they sent him to Egypt, the Gentile world, that is, where he was embraced, trusted, and exalted, with the result that he could save many of them. And this agrees perfectly with what we read in Romans 11, from verse 11 right through to verse 30. Joseph went on to say that it was God's plan that he would suffer and then be exalted in Egypt, not just for the salvation of the Gentiles, but also to save the people and nation of Israel, and that he pointed that out in verse 7. Likewise, the purpose of Jesus' suffering and exaltation to God's right hand and his exaltation among the nations was not just for the salvation of the Gentiles, but also for the salvation of the nation of Israel, which again is a theme of Romans chapter 11. Joseph then proclaimed that he had been made Lord of all Egypt, and that they should go and tell this to their father, to Israel, and to invite him to come with his whole family and all their possessions to Joseph and live with him, and that they should not delay, for indeed there were still 5 years of famine left to run, as he points out in verse 8 to 11. This signifies that in the tribulation, Jesus will not be satisfied with many of his Israelite brethren coming to him to be saved and to dwell with him, but he wants more. He wants the whole nation of Israel, which is represented by the father Jacob, Israel. He wants the whole nation to come to him in faith and to be saved, not just many individuals, many of its sons. You see, the one with all authority, who is Lord and Savior of the whole world, will make a special call in the tribulation for his people, the whole nation of Israel, to come to him and accept him as their Lord. And this they will do. And as a result, as Romans 11:25 says, all Israel will be saved. This denotes the fact it's not just many Israelites, but the nation itself will be saved. And he will dwell in their midst. So, It says in Genesis 46:26, it says, "So they returned and told Jacob, 'Joseph is alive, and he is Lord over all Egypt.'" At first, Israel was in shock. It seemed impossible, but faced with all the evidence, he finally believed, and he was filled with joy. We see that in verse 27 and 28. Well, when he was aged 56, that's when Jacob died. Israel died, which was 17 years after he entered Egypt. We read that in Genesis 47:28. When Joseph was 110, that's when he died. We read in Genesis 50:26, "So Joseph died, being 110 years old, and they embalmed him, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt." And this is where the book of Genesis ends. Exodus picks up the story, describing how sometime after Joseph died, the Egyptians subjected Israel to slavery, partly due to a population explosion among the Israelites. And that's recorded in Exodus chapter 1. The birth of Moses is described in Acts 7, verse 17 to 20, which says, "When the time of the promise drew near, which God had sworn to Abraham," that's back in Genesis 15, "the people grew and multiplied in Egypt, until another king arose who did not know Joseph. This man dealt treacherously with our people and oppressed our forefathers, making them expose their babies, so that they might not live. At this time Moses was born." Notice that this proves that the common idea that the slavery in Egypt lasted for 400 years is completely wrong, because actually it started shortly before Moses was born. Therefore, it must have been less than 100 years in all. Moses was brought up in the royal palace as an Egyptian prince. Acts 7:21 and 22 points this out. But he also had a relationship with his natural family, Israel, as is recorded in Exodus 2:8-10. Now, at age 40, Moses was forced to escape to Midian after killing an Egyptian, in an act of defending and saving an Israelite from being beaten. That's in Exodus 2:11-15. We read the New Testament interpretation of this in Acts 7:23-29. It says, "Now, when he was 40 years old, it came into his heart to visit his brethren, the children of Israel. And seeing one of them suffer wrong, he defended and avenged him who was oppressed, and struck down the Egyptian. For he supposed that his brethren would have understood that God would deliver them by his hand, but they did not understand. And the next day he appeared to two of them as they were fighting, and tried to reconcile them, saying, 'Men, you are brethren. Why do you wrong one another?' But he who did his neighbor wrong pushed him away, saying, 'Who made you a ruler and judge over us? Do you want to kill me, as you did the Egyptian yesterday?' Then at this saying Moses fled, knowing that what he had done now was public knowledge. And he became a dweller in the land of Midian, where he had 2 sons. Now it's commonly thought that Moses missed it here. Being aware of his call to be Israel's deliverer, he moved in the flesh to save his people before the time. But this is actually not how the New Testament interprets it. Hebrews 11 tells us that this was actually an act of faith. It says, "By faith Moses, when he became of age, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he looked to the reward." That's Hebrews 11:24-26. In Exodus 2:12, it puts it like this: "When he saw his brother being oppressed, he looked around to see if there was anyone who would save him. But there was no one. So rather than preserving his status and riches in Egypt, he chose to identify with the people of God, being prepared to suffer affliction as a result, if necessary. Stephen in Acts 7 agrees, for he is bringing a charge against the Jewish leaders for rejecting Christ, and he's using examples from Israel's history to provide parallels that illustrate their sin. That's why he concludes his prosecution speech by saying, "You always resist the Holy Spirit, as your fathers did, so do you. Which of the prophets did your fathers not persecute? And they killed those who foretold the coming of the Just One, of whom you now have become the betrayers and murderers." That's Acts 7, 51 and 52. As part of his case, Stephen uses Moses as a type of Christ. Acts 7:37 goes on to say, "This is that Moses who said to the children of Israel, 'The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from your brethren. Him shall you hear and obey.'" And so he is using Moses as a picture of what will happen with Christ. That as Moses was rejected by his brethren, so Christ was rejected by his brethren. It's in this light of Stephen's statement here that we should interpret his statements about Moses. He is showing, you see, that Israel's initial rejection of Moses when he was 40 parallels their rejection of Christ at his first coming. As the prophet like unto Moses, Jesus came to bring Israel into a new covenant, mediated by himself. But they didn't receive him. Israel rejected Moses when he came to them the first time as their deliverer. Stephen says that they should have understood that God had sent him to save them, but instead they rejected him, saying, "Who made you a ruler and judge over us?" This exactly parallels Israel's response to Jesus, the greater than Moses, at his first coming. The result of rejecting Moses as their saviour was that he left them and went far away, so that their delivery and entry into a new covenant was delayed for 40 years. And meanwhile, they had to continue under Gentile oppression for another 40 years, with Moses absent from them. Likewise, instead of bringing national Israel into the new covenant, Jesus had to leave them, delaying their national salvation for 2,000 years. So that meanwhile, Israel had to continue under Gentile oppression for another 2,000 years or so. Now, when Moses was aged 80, God sent him back to deliver Israel from Egyptian bondage, after he'd spent 40 years as a shepherd in Midian. Acts 7:30 says, "When 40 years were expired or fulfilled, there appeared to him in the wilderness of Mount Sinai an angel of the Lord, in a flame of fire in a bush." Now, Moses was 80 years old, and Aaron was 83 years old when they spoke to Pharaoh. That's according to Exodus 7:7. We can see this timing also from Moses' death at 120. Because Deuteronomy 34:7 tells us Moses died at 120. And this, of course, was at the end of 40 years of wilderness wanderings. Therefore, he had to be 80 at the Exodus. But it's Acts 7 that reveals to us that he was in Egypt for 40 years, and then in Midian for 40 years, making up those 80 years. Notice that God works by a timetable and keeps his appointments. There are appointed times in the life of Moses. God appeared to him and told him to deliver his people when the 40 years were fulfilled. That's Acts 7:30. You see, a definite time had to elapse before he came to Moses. Once he had completed this 40-year phase in Midian, God brought him into the next phase of his life. Like Moses, Jesus will return to Israel as judge, deliverer, and king after he has been the shepherd of his people among the nations. At the burning bush, God commissioned Moses to go set his people free from their oppression and their slavery. This return of Moses to save his people a second time at the Exodus can be seen as a type of the second coming to save Israel from the Antichrist, the 10 plagues corresponding to the 10 bowls of wrath. As he brought them out of oppression and into a national covenant with God, so Jesus will save Israel and bring them into the new covenant as a nation. The one who was initially rejected by Israel in his first coming to deliver them is the same one who was sent by God to save them in his second coming. But this time they accepted him as their deliverer and ruler. And now Stephen makes this very point. He says, this Moses, whom Israel rejected when he was 40, saying, who made you a ruler and a judge, is the very same one that God sent to be ruler and deliverer by the hand of the angel who appeared to him in the bush, that is, when he was aged 80. Stephen goes on to say, he brought them out, after he had shown wonders and signs in the land of Egypt and in the Red Sea, and in the wilderness 40 years. That's Acts 7:35 and 36. In speaking of Moses, Stephen is really declaring the parallel truths about Jesus, the prophet like unto Moses. In Acts 7:37, Stephen went on to say, this is that Moses who said to the children of Israel, the Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from your brethren, him shall you hear. Therefore, he is saying that the one whom that generation had rejected as Lord and Saviour is nevertheless God's anointed one, who will return to save Israel by his mighty power. But this will be for a future generation, who will receive him. For the generation that had rejected him will have to remain under oppression and judgment, because they rejected their salvation. They rejected Christ. Thus the 2 times that Moses came to Israel to save them are a picture of the 2 comings of Christ. From when Moses was aged 80 to when he was aged 120, Israel wandered in the wilderness for 40 years because of unbelief. For that generation rejected God's offer to possess the promised land. In Acts chapter 7, Stephen was pointing to sins in Israel's history and saying to his generation that had rejected Christ, your sin is just like this, but only worse. They rejected Moses, but you rejected the greater than Moses. Then in verses 38 to 43 in Acts 7, Stephen now makes another analogy from Moses' life, using him again as a type of Christ. This time, he pointed to the sin of the Exodus generation in rejecting the leadership of Moses. He says, whom our fathers would not obey, but rejected. That's in verse 39. He now views the Exodus as a type of Christ's first coming to save Israel and to offer his messianic kingdom to that generation. But their unbelief meant that they could not enter the land, so its possession was postponed for 40 years, when another generation, a later generation, would possess it by faith. And so likewise, the generation who rejected Jesus as king through unbelief could not receive his messianic kingdom, so it was postponed for 2,000 years. For a later generation to possess it by faith, as Jesus had said in Matthew 21:43, that the kingdom would be taken from them and given to another people, another generation. Meanwhile, just as Israel had to wander in the wilderness for 40 years due to unbelief, so she has to wander in the wilderness of the nations for 2,000 years. Now, when Moses was 120, that's when he died. Deuteronomy 34:7 says, Moses was 120 years old when he died. You see, Moses was 80 when he led Israel out of Egypt in the Exodus, and he led them in the wilderness for the next 40 years, at the end of which he died at the age of 120, just before they went in to the promised land. So we see God's perfect design of Moses' life as 3 distinct phases of 40 years. First of all, Moses in Egypt, 40 years, Acts 7:23. Secondly, Moses in Midian, 40 years, that's Acts 7:30. And then thirdly, Moses in the wilderness after the Exodus for 40 years. That's Acts 7:36 and 42. So we have established every time period except the time between Joseph's death and Moses' birth. We know the chronology from the birth of Abraham to the death of Joseph, and we know the chronology from the birth of Moses to the Exodus. So all that remains is to find the time between Joseph's death and Moses' birth. There is a gap in the chronology here. We are not told this length of time. However, as always, the chronology of the Bible is complete, for we can calculate it from the 430 years from Abraham's entry into the land to the Exodus. Consider the whole time covered by the 430 years that are defined by Exodus 12, verse 40 and 41, and we also saw it in Galatians chapter 3. If we add up all the separate times that we know in this time period of 430 years, we get 10 years, plus 15 years, plus 60 years, plus 91 years, plus 110 years, plus 40 years, plus 40 years, making 366 years. This includes all the times except the unknown time, but the total time is 430 years. So the unknown time, that is, from Joseph's death to Moses' birth, must be 430 minus 366 years. That is, 64 years, in order to make up the 430 years. Finally, we can verify the fact that the 430 years from Adam's entry into the land until the Exodus is neatly divided into two halves. And this is further evidence of divine design. For the first 215 years, they mainly sojourned in Canaan. For the second 215 years, they settled in Egypt and eventually became slaves there. The time from Abraham's entry to Joseph's birth was 10 years, plus 15 years, plus 60 years, plus 91 years, making a total of 176 years. We then showed that the family entered Egypt when Joseph was 39. So from the time from Abraham's entry into Canaan until their exit into Egypt was 176 plus 39 years, which is 215 years. Exactly half of the 430 years. Now we're going to summarize the whole Great Jubilee cycle from Abraham's birth to the Exodus out of Egypt. So, if we add up all these time periods, we will find that they add up to 505 years. It's easy to see this, first of all, because there's the 75 years, the first 75 years of Abraham's life, which is what leads up to when he entered the land. And then we are told, of course, that there's a further 430 years until the Exodus. So simply adding those two numbers together gives us the 505 years. Alternatively, if we add them up separately, we get 75 years, then 10 years, then 1 year, then 14 years, then 5 years, then 55 years, then 91 years, then 110 years, then 64 years, then 40 years, and then the final 40 years. And if we add that up, we get 505 years. Now remember that in this period of 505 years, 15 of those years were unreckoned. This was the time between Ishmael's conception, that's when Abraham got in the flesh, as it were, and tried to do God's plan by his own strength. From Ishmael's conception, when Abraham was 85, until Isaac's birth, when he was aged 100, those 15 years were unreckoned. So if we subtract the unreckoned time from the 505 years, we get a total of 505 minus 15, which is 490 years. And there we have it. We have a great Jubilee cycle on God's redemption calendar.